Well, I don't want to give everybody whiplash, but we're going to go from the end of time to the beginning of time now, all right? I don't know if you've seen this thing on Facebook. I've seen it several different times now. Little boy comes in and asks his dad, Dad, where did we come from? And so his dad says, well, in the beginning, God made Adam and Eve, and then he told them to be fruitful and multiply, and so it's just come down to us. So God created us. He says, well, that's not what Mom says. He said, Mom says that, we're descended from the monkeys and kind of through evolution. So the dad says, well, son, she was talking about her side of the family. I kind of have it in my heart to take us through the Old Testament between now and Passion Week. We're gonna kind of race through the general ideas, the principal ideas that are in the historical part of the Old Testament to get us to Jesus on Palm Sunday, and then we'll, as many of you know, every year during Passion Week we have times, special services that mark what was going on in Jesus' life in that last week. So we're going to start at the beginning. So open your Bibles to Genesis 1. We'll be looking at this. I'm convinced that a lot of our problems in the world can be traced back to two things. For one thing, it can be traced back to Darwin's Origin of the Species, when men began to accept the concept that evolution could explain all of life, and they began to think about how they began to examine things and began to believe that everything had a natural explanation. We could figure it all out if we just studied long enough and dug deep enough. We'd be able to explain everything. And one of the reasons that we felt that is because our second problem is that went before that one was when we went into the age of reason. The idea is that everything needed to have a rational explanation and be able to figure things out and basically we know that everything has a cause, and so we can figure why we are where we are about what went on before us. So there was a rational explanation for everything. We began to trust our man's ability to figure things out on his own. So that developed a great distrust in the Bible at that time, and then particularly there's been some conflict over this chapter, this very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1, as people begin to try to figure out how can you make Genesis 1 mesh with modern science. Believe me, I've longed to be able to do that for a long time because I love science. I particularly love to study what's called cosmology. That you study how the world comes together and what it means. But I'm going to give you, I believe, what I've come to. I'm going to share with you at least my understanding of it this morning. But I think it would do us good just to read the chapter. So if y'all would like to follow along, you're there. You can see the Pew Bibles there are the same version I have, so you should be able to go along with it. I would encourage you to watch for patterns as we're reading through it. Each day has its own has a pattern that is followed. There's a kind of a system to it. And I would encourage you to particularly notice how often God is mentioned. All right? Chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. Then God said, "Let there be a firmament," or an expanse, "in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. Some modern translations will have sky there. And so the evening and the morning were the second day. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the third day. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament as of the heavens, to divide the day from the night. And let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens, to give light on the earth." And it was so. Then God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. Just kind of throw that in. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the fourth day. And then God said, "Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens." So God created great sea creatures, and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, and saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." So the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature, according to its kind, cattle, and creeping thing, and beast of the earth, each according to its kind." And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "See, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of the earth, of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food. Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food." And it was so. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. We'll stop there before the seventh day. As you read through this, I'm sure multiple questions pop in your mind. You'd like an explanation for this and for that. I probably won't get to your favorite questions this morning. And time really doesn't allow us to deal with everything that arises out of this. One of the most helpful things I ever ran across was a commentator, a Bible scholar, who made the explanation that there really is no debate over the first chapter of Genesis. It's over the interpretations of the first chapter of Genesis. And one of the main problems I think a lot of us have is we try to make Genesis tell us things that it wasn't meant to tell us. We are interested in what we want to know instead of trying to figure out what God wants us to know out of this chapter. So we wind up with questions like, well, I wonder maybe if we kind of stretch the meaning of day, can we make all the geological periods, can we make harmonize things that way? Or some people might say, well, if we just put a gap between verse 1 and verse 2, we could put a lot of things in there that actually this is not God created everything in verse 1, and then there was a gap there, which was probably the war between the angels that came down, and that left the earth desolate, so God had to remake it in 6 days. And so what we see now, we could not worry about how old the rocks are because that was in verse 1, and then we can just deal with the other stuff that starts in verse 2. Were these 20, how can you get around these being 24-hour days when it talks about morning and evening? So they apparently have to be 24-hour days. There's just all kinds of questions. How can you have light and then before the sun and the moon were created? What is that? There's just all kinds of questions that you could come up with. But what does this passage actually tell us, and what was it meant to tell us? I began to appreciate what chapter 1 tells us when I began to realize that there's a structure to the chapter. Not just in the 6 days of creation, but within the 6 days, there's actually two main themes. You remember that verse 2 says, now the earth was without form and void or empty. So now this is not my own insight. I did this through study from other guys. If you look at how chapter 1 is structured, you'll find out that it's meant to take care of those two problems. The earth was without form, it was formless, and it was void, it was empty. So what you see is God working to give structure or form to the earth and then fill in those forms. So what you see in chapter 1, in the first 3 days, he creates, first of all, light and divides that from the darkness. And then on day 2, he creates the atmosphere. So we have water above and we have the water in the seas below. So then he has that. That's the structure. And then he brings out the dry land on day 3. Now it's interesting because both day 3 and day 6 have 2 sections. You have one section in day 1, one section in day 2. You have 2 sections in day 3. He causes the dry land to come forth, and then he causes the vegetation to sprout. So he does 2 things on day 3. So what does he do on day 4? That light he has created now has stars and sun and moon and things there. And so we have that. He's taken that light that he created, and now he's filling that in with the sun and the moon and things like that. One of the interesting things about the sun and moon creation is, notice he just keeps calling them lights. He doesn't really call it the sun and the moon. And the reason he doesn't use the word sun and moon, because in the original language, the words for sun and moon could be confused for names for gods and goddesses. So in order to avoid any connection with idolatry, He just calls them lights that were there. And so the sun and the moon are not given names in here. They're not even called by what we would call them. By the way, that would be true for today. Most of us don't realize that when we say the word Monday, we're talking about the moon. And when we say the word Saturday, we're talking about the god Saturn, and so on like that. So the biblical writer, Moses, was trying to avoid all that. So day 4, he puts the stars and the sun and the moon in those places. And then on day 5, the waters and the sky now get filled with birds and fish and other sea creatures. And then on day 6, the dry land is now populated with animals and then with man. So you can see that there's a structure to it. One other man has looked at this chapter, and he gave this insight to it. He said that if you look at what's described in Genesis 1, you see 2 categories of creation. Some things are non-living, minerals, stuff, material things, and then living. So you have 2 types. You have non-living and then living. And then you have 2 categories of things that are living. You have plants, and then you have animals. And then you have 2 types of animals. You have the lower animals, which are the beasts and so on, and then the higher animal, which is mankind. So you see that there's those divisions in there, and you can begin to appreciate how what this tells us about the structure of the world and the universe that we live in. It's very important, I think, to allow us to understand that what the Bible is really trying to tell us is not how God created everything. It's trying to tell us who created. That is really the emphasis of this chapter. It is meant to tell us that God did it. An interesting exercise I would tell you to do perhaps is something I did yesterday. I just sat down and took every place where the word God was mentioned and then talked about what did God do. And so, for instance, I found that it says that God created at least 3 times. It says that God said 10 times. God saw 7 times. God divided once. God called 3 times. God made 3 times. God set 1 time. And then twice God blessed. So 30 times in 31 verses, God. You kind of get the idea that maybe that's what the chapter is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about God. And everything there, you can see everything that's there, it's that God did it. So we're to see in this that we're meant to see that everything that exists goes back to God. He is the creator of it all. I have shared with y'all before that one thing that really made this chapter speak to me was when I realized exactly where the word created is used. Now, sometimes we get to think, well, God created the animals and God created flowers and God created all this. But created is used only in 3 places in this chapter. The word created. And the word in the Hebrew that we translate created is a word, a verb that is used with only God as the subject. This verb, created, it never ever says that an artisan created or Moses created, or this word for created is only used with God. That God is the only one who does this. He's the only subject in the Bible of that verb. And so notice it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. He created it all. In fact, I believe that verse 1 is just kind of a summary statement, kind of that says that sets off everything. In other words, it's everything. And what happens in verse 2, notice verse 2 starts off now, the earth. So instead of saying we got verse 1, everything's created, now let's focus things down now into the earth. We're just dealing with the earth from verse 2 all the way through verse 31. And then what happens is when you come to chapter 2, verse 4, as we get through with the seventh day, you find out that the focus shifts from the earth to man. And so in chapter 2, we have the creation of Adam and Eve. So what is happening, you will understand the Bible, it's not like there's two different accounts of creation. Some people have been really bothered by the fact that in chapter 1, you have one version, in chapter 2, and apparently you have another version because Adam and Eve are created and then God creates the animals and so on. No, what you have really is a difference of focus. In chapter 1, you're focusing on the earth as the planet, and then in chapter 2, you're focusing on mankind. And so understand that there's two different things going on there. So in chapter 1, verse 1, God created everything. You don't run into that word again until verse 21, where God began to create animal life. So when he begins to create breathing creatures, that's where he begins to create again animals, living things that move. He did cause the earth to bring forth plants and trees and things in the earth on the third day. But here he begins to create living things. So he creates. And the other place that creation is used is in verse 27. He says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So 3 times God creates. And create means to bring something into existence out of nothing. You didn't use any pre-existing material. It's not like he fashioned something or formed it or anything. He didn't make it. He created it. He brought it into existence out of nothing. Okay? Now, I find it fascinating that the word create is used in the 3 places where science cannot explain what's going on. For instance, science has a lot of explanations, but it cannot explain to us how everything came out of nothing. Right? Where did it all come from? Y'all know one of my favorite stories. I'm going to use it to you to tell me to quit telling it. You've heard it too often. You know, supposedly the story's told about a bunch of scientists who came to God who said, God, we've understood now how to make life. We can do it. We can make something that lives. We can, you created life, but we can create life too. And God said, we can make a human being. They said, all right. God says, all right, well, let's see what you got. And so they bent down to get some earth, some dirt, to begin to make this human being. And God said, wait a minute. Get your own dirt, right? It's not just a matter, and by the way, all those experiments in trying to find the chemical formula that caused life to begin, to recreate, those have yet to work. They never have really worked. And so man is not creating life, even with all of our knowledge. And if they could create it, all they would demonstrate was it took someone who knew what they were doing to make it happen. It didn't all happen by chance anyway. So it all came, this explains to us how everything came out of nothing. It shows where life comes, because how can you believe that something that has no life in it is going to actually produce something that's alive? We're going to believe that just different chemicals combined in a certain way that then all of a sudden now, poof, it began to be alive. Non-living things, there's not a single example of how non-living things can produce life. And then the third thing that scientists can't explain is why human beings are so different from any other creature on the earth. And that's the third place where we see that God created. So even if you want to believe that plants developed other plants and things, and there was evolution in those things, or some animals produced other animals and so on, you can't explain. God created those things. God created. And so we can begin to appreciate this is what it's about. It's telling us that God is behind everything. I personally believe that the reason that most people want to believe in evolution or want to believe in the scientific answer to everything is because they really want to get rid of God. They want to be able to live life without any constraints. They don't want to feel like they're going to be held accountable. They don't want to feel like that they owe anybody anything. And so they just they're going to say, well, this is all there is. There's no purpose in life. We're all out to just make the best life that we can. We don't believe that there's a creator. Because really, isn't that what most people believe? If they begin to talk about God, that's what they think of. They think about the creator. Whoever the creator is, that is God, right? All right. But I'm just saying that when we begin to think about who or what God is, we think of him in terms of being the creator of everything. Okay? So, if we believe that then that's really what we need to understand. The Bible is telling us, look, this stuff has not been around forever. And I have about 3 minutes to run through every possible explanation for where everything came from, and I don't think I'm going to be able to pull that off. I have here 5 different arguments for creation, there being a creator. C.S. Lewis talks about knowing right or wrong. The fact that we have a standard of right and wrong indicates that we have a standard for what is right and what is fair and what is good given to us from somewhere. It's always, he calls it right and wrong is a clue to the meaning of the universe. So our moral sense indicates that there's a God. We have to believe that there's a creator because what the whole world shows us is that things don't come together to get better. They tend to fall apart. The second law of thermodynamics, I understand, talks about how energy disperses and you can't get it back. You can't unscramble an egg. Just things are continuing. The world is continuing to run down. Energy disperses and becomes less useful. And so the idea is that really the world does not build up and become more and more complex. It actually deteriorates and goes back to its simple matter. I was reading this morning about a man who was talking about how they develop roses, and they had been able to develop roses that would have, instead of having 44 petals, they would have as many as 56 and as few as 32, and they could manipulate those things. But he says as soon as you left roses to themselves, they would always begin to revert back to what the wild rose was that started it all. If you don't continually manipulate with it, it will revert to its original form, which is the wildness. I think humankind is demonstrating that today. We don't really get under God's care. We begin to revert to our wild form, which is exactly what we see going on. You can't explain. One of the most interesting things to me about showing a creator is, where did all the instructions in the DNA come from? I don't understand how our single DNA can tell some cells to become nerve cells, and some to become blood cells, and some to become bone, and others to become muscle. And how does that all happen? And who started? All of those instructions telling the cells what to do are all in our DNA, but who put the information in the DNA? Who programmed that computer? Anywhere there is information, there has to be an intelligence there behind it. Has to be a God. You could just use that as an example of the whole design thing. Scientists now are just baffled. In fact, they have given it a term calling it the anthropic principle. I know y'all come every Sunday hoping to improve your vocabulary when I use these big words, but the whole idea behind the anthropic principle is the idea that it appears that the universe has been made for mankind's benefit. for instance, one of the things is we're not in the center of the Milky Way. We're out on one of the little arms somewhere, kind of away from everything on the boundaries. But what that has done is given us a perspective which enables us to view and explore the rest of the universe with our telescopes. Instead of being in the center where there'd be all kinds of difficulties, being in the center of the galaxy. So just our place in the Milky Way galaxy. Talk about our place, the relationship of the Earth to the sun. We're in what's called the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, right? So we're just right. And so many, many things. Why does water, it is one of the, in fact, the only element that I know of that as it turns into a solid, expands rather than continue to contract. And because of that, that causes ice to form on the top of the lake or the river or places like that, so that it doesn't kill all the creatures that are down underneath. Just things, so many different things that show that, I mean, one of the main ones is the relationship between the dynamic forces in physics, which I don't completely comprehend, so I'm not going to go any further than that, but just to understand that the only reason that our sun continues to be able to generate heat and light is because those forces are between gravity and the electromagnetic force and everything are so finely tuned and balanced that it enables the sun to continue to not collapse in on itself or to fly apart. And it's just, there's just so many things. There's like hundreds of different little things that show that life has been fine-tuned for our existence. That by chance? After a while, there's so many things that have to be so unlikely going to happen, you're getting down to where the chances of that happening are pretty much zero. And so that's the reason you hear so many people talking about intelligence design, the irreducible complexity of things. I could go into a long time. One of the most interesting arguments to me, though, is what's called the Kalam argument. And that basically means there had to be a cause to start everything that was not itself caused. When you were a kid, did you ever wonder who made God? That ever ask you, did you ever wonder about that? Well, if God made everything, who made God? So some people would like for us to believe there can be an infinite regression back, because everything has a cause, right? That has occurred to you, right? Everything has a cause. Something caused me to exist. You can ask, if my mom and dad were alive, you could ask them about it, right? So everything has a cause. You can go back, to see different things, and everything is a result of a prior happening. But how far back can you go? Can you go back infinitely? Which a philosopher will tell you that if the past is infinite, there could be no present. You understand? Because you would never get here. It's infinite. You could never get to the present if the past were infinite. That's mind-boggling, isn't it? You begin to think about it. But this argument begins says everything that began to exist had a cause, and the universe began to exist. Now, this is what has really began to bother scientists, because they for years wanted to argue that the universe was what was eternal and infinite. But now we find out that the universe had a beginning, right? The Big Bang. Beginning to sound more and more like the Bible all the time, that it actually had a beginning. But what caused the Big Bang? And it really bothers scientists because there's no way to explore what happened before the Big Bang. You can't tell what happened. But this argument would say there had to be an uncaused cause. Something had to start it all. And that something means that it exists outside of our universe. And so it would have to be spaceless and timeless, infinite and eternal. It didn't have a beginning itself. It's immaterial. It's changeless. And it is extremely powerful because it had to make it happen. We call that God. there had to be someone who started the whole thing, who knocked over the first domino. It didn't knock itself over. Someone had to. And then there was a succession. What does all that mean? If we take what the Bible is telling us, we understand it's telling us that everything is due to Him. Everything comes from Him. And I believe that means we should acknowledge it. We should acknowledge that. We need to quit trying to work around there being a creator. We are constantly bombarded with people telling you, well, the reason that this is so is because of evolution. You know, this is how this has come about. And I will grant you that species adapt, they change over time. But there is absolutely no example of one species turning into a different species ever. There are all kinds of varieties of dogs. But you know what? They're all dogs. There's never been a dog that became a cat, right? There can be development within the kind, but those kinds remain the same. I've never seen a cat turn into a cow. I mean, it just doesn't happen. So we need to acknowledge that there is a creator. And if everything comes from Him, then everything belongs to Him. We're just the caretakers, right? And we're stewards. We're going to have to give an account of how we've done with everything that He's given us and how we've treated the creation that He's given us. So we need to understand that. We should be thankful for what He's given, because everything that we have has come from Him. The other thing that it tells me is that everything is ruled by Him. He is the Lord over everything. He didn't just wind it up and let it go. He is supervising everything that happens. He is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Everything, power and might and creation comes from Him. I really believe that if you study history, you will understand that America was victorious in World War II because God enabled us to invent the things that we needed to win the war. Do you understand it? That inventiveness, that comes as God puts ideas in people's heads. God's the one that's controlling all those things. God raises up men to be leaders. And others, whether they're good leaders or bad leaders. So we understand everything is controlled by Him. We are His servants. We are His servants, and we should obey Him. It is His will. It is the main thing we would ever come as Christians is to understand that I'm here to do God's will. Doing God's will is the highest thing that I can do with my life. But that means I need to find out what it is. I need to constantly be looking to guide me, to train me. So everything is ruled and controlled by Him. And the fourth thing I would say is the last thing. Everything exists for Him. He deserves the glory and the honor. I learned, Mark taught me back about 40 years ago, a chorus that comes out of the book of Revelation. If you go to chapter 4 of the book of Revelation, you'll find they're singing this song. See if I can get it out. Thou art worthy, thou art worthy, thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory, glory and honor, glory and honor and power. For thou hast all things created. Thou hast created all things. and for thy pleasure they were created. Thou art worthy, O Lord. And that's what should be. Everything exists for him, for his glory. Let's thank our Creator. Father in heaven, we thank you and recognize you as the one who has made, created everything. Everything comes from you. Everything belongs to you. Everything is ruled by you. And everything exists for you. May we accept that we are your creatures. We are the sheep of your pasture because you made us. We did not make ourselves. So we are yours. We belong. We are your servants. Use us as you will. We pray in Jesus' name.